There is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up in the body but arrives shortly after the conversation ends. It appears when your phone finally goes quiet, when you close the door behind you, or when the last group message is answered. It isn't dislike, frustration, or rudeness, it's simply the feeling that something inside you has been used up. For some people, socializing isn't unpleasant, it's simply draining. For a long time, this type of experience was interpreted as a problem that needed fixing. If you feel exhausted after interacting, the explanation often comes ready-made. Maybe you're too shy, insecure, unsociable, or emotionally closed off. But psychology looks at this phenomenon from another angle. In many cases, social exhaustion doesn't indicate difficulty with connection, but rather a specific style of emotional and cognitive processing. Not all minds respond to human stimuli in the same way. Conversation requires more than words. It requires constant attention, reading subtle signals, adapting to another person's rhythm, regulating responses, emotional presence. For some people, this set of processes happens automatically and feels energizing. For others, it happens deeply, intensely, and with high awareness. And when that kind of attention is sustained, exhaustion becomes inevitable. The central point isn't whether you like people or not. Many people who feel exhausted after socializing value relationships, enjoy good conversations, and genuinely care about others. What changes is the internal cost of that interaction. After a while, the emotional system asks for a pause, not out of rejection, but out of a need for internal reorganization. Silence, in this case, isn't withdrawal, it's recovery. Psychology makes an important distinction here. There is exhaustion that comes from social anxiety, fear of judgment, or the constant effort to meet external expectations. This kind of fatigue is usually accompanied by tension and self-criticism. But there is also regulatory exhaustion, the kind that appears when a person has simply used their available emotional capacity. This second type isn't a sign of fragility, it's a sign of self-awareness. When culture treats social exhaustion as a personal failure, it creates unnecessary internal conflict. The person starts fighting their own rhythm, forcing interactions, stacking commitments, and ignoring clear signs of overload. Over time, it isn't socializing that hurts, but the misalignment between what one does and what one needs in order to function well. Feeling tired after socializing says nothing about emotional competence, maturity, or personal worth. It only says something about how that mind processes human stimuli, and that varies far more than we usually admit. For some people, silence isn't emptiness, it's space. Space to integrate thoughts, process emotions, and return to their own center. When that space is respected, the quality of connections tends to increase, not decrease, because presence stops being an obligation and becomes a choice. Social energy, instead of being scattered, concentrates where it truly matters. This doesn't mean there are no risks. Prolonged and unwanted isolation can indeed cause suffering. Psychology clearly differentiates imposed loneliness from chosen solitude. One weakens, the other restores. Confusing the two is a common and harmful mistake. People who recognize their social limits tend to develop more honest relationships with their time and with others. They don't disappear out of fear, nor do they stay out of guilt. They adjust closeness according to what they can emotionally sustain. This kind of adjustment is often associated with greater internal clarity, emotional autonomy, and an identity that is less dependent on constant validation. It's also no coincidence that many of these people have an active inner world. Thoughts continue organizing themselves even in the absence of external stimulation. For this type of functioning, continuous interactions can interrupt important processes of reflection and creation. Exhaustion appears as a signal that the mind needs continuity, not more input. Contemporary psychology understands this as legitimate variation, not deviation. There is no universal measure of how much social contact is ideal. What exists is compatibility between psychological style and environment. When that compatibility is missing, the body and mind find ways to signal it. Exhaustion is one of them. Perhaps the most honest question isn't why do I feel this way, but what is this exhaustion trying to preserve? Instead of fighting one's internal response, many people find greater balance when they begin listening to it without judgment. This doesn't require radical isolation or drastic changes. It only requires alignment. In the end, the psychology of people who feel exhausted after socializing isn't about rejecting the world. It's about recognizing limits. Some people restore themselves through constant exchange, others through the silence between exchanges. Neither is wrong. What truly drains us is living out of sync with our internal rhythm. When alignment exists, exhaustion stops feeling like a problem and becomes just a signal that the mind is taking care of itself. You may recognize this moment. It isn't during the conversation, it's afterward. When everything ends and instead of immediate relief, there comes a deep urge to be quiet, to not respond to anyone, to not explain anything. Not because something went wrong, but because something inside you was used up. And for a long time, you may have interpreted that as a flaw. It's easy to think that this exhaustion means a lack of social skill, that if talking drains you, then you should practice more, expose yourself more, insist until you get used to it. But what's rarely said is that not all exhaustion needs correction. Some need understanding, because not every human system operates at the same rhythm. When you socialize, many things happen inside you at once. Constant attention, reading signals, emotional adjustment, presence. For some people, this flows with little effort. For others, it happens deeply and consciously. You notice nuances, you absorb the atmosphere, you process what's said and what isn't, and that comes at a cost. The issue isn't liking or disliking people. Often you like them, you care, you listen, you engage, but afterward you feel the need to return to yourself, not to withdraw from the world, but to reorganize what you felt. Silence in that moment isn't emptiness, it's restoration. You may have already noticed that when you respect this limit, something changes. Interactions stop feeling like obligations. Presence stops feeling heavy. You begin choosing more carefully where to place your energy. And interestingly, the relationships that remain tend to be more genuine, not because you have fewer people around, but because you're whole when you choose to be present. This doesn't mean you never feel lonely. It simply means you've learned to distinguish between two very different experiences. Being alone is sometimes just being with yourself. True loneliness, on the other hand, often appears in the middle of a crowd, when you feel you must perform, explain yourself, sustain something that doesn't reflect who you are. When you feel exhausted after socializing, it may not be a sign of rejection toward others, but of loyalty to yourself. Your system is telling you it needs a pause in order to continue functioning well. It isn't isolation, it's regulation. Psychology understands this as legitimate variation. Some people recharge through constant contact, others through the space between contacts. Neither is superior. What hurts most of the time is living out of sync with your internal rhythm, trying to sustain a social model that wasn't made for you. Perhaps the most honest question isn't why am I like this, but what happens when I listen to myself? Because when there's alignment between what you do and what you need, exhaustion stops feeling like a problem. It becomes just a signal that you are taking care of your energy, your presence, and the way you choose to exist in the world. And sometimes choosing silence isn't giving up on connection. It's simply the most sincere way you've found to preserve it. If this content helped you understand something about yourself, consider subscribing to the channel. New videos like this continue exploring the psychology behind experiences that are rarely explained out loud.